Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about rural institutions, economic institutions. So to think, essentially, we're going to simplify and think about agricultural output in low-income economies as essentially using two main inputs, labor and land, which is to say we're going to ignore capital. Capital is more important, more modern forms of agriculture, but for low-income countries, we can simplify and think essentially you need land and you need labor in order to produce agricultural good. Um, so land ownership, typically as we saw, is not equally distributed. And so a rural institution or contract or any arrangement essentially has to answer the question, how can landowners and labor work together and how they're going to distribute the output that they produce? And how, on the other hand, another important issue is dealing with risk associated with agricultural products. If there's a big plague of locusts, or there is bad weather, or a drought, and agricultural production takes a big hit, and that can mean starvation for the worker. And so, how is that risk going to be reduced? There's different kind of risk. And there's risk at the individual level. For example, you may get sick and not be able to go to work. And there is village or even seasonal or even economy-wide levels, like there is a COVID-19 pandemic and nobody can go to work, or there is some kind of a drought which affects everybody in the village. And so those are examples of more aggregate or village level risk. The key idea that we're going to kind of assume is that people don't like risk. They prefer to have their consumption as stable as possible. They have to have 1 year plentiful of production and the next year to go starving. Normally this would be taking place. They could take an insurance against their crop. And that's essentially what the modern financial markets do to share the risk of many different people. But in the absence of formal insurance market, there's no insurance companies operating in rural India that you can go and insure your crop, then people have to insure each other on their own. And so one way in which you can do that is simply by choosing a safer crop. And you may have a low expected return, low risk crop, and then you have another crop that is more risky, but if it works out well, you can sell it for more money. Then if you're risk averse, you are going to stick to the traditional safe crop, and this may explain lower productivity. And so this is an important point to see. If you're worried about lower agricultural productivity, you have to look at the root of that. And the root in this case it would be the lack, in this example, lack of formal insurance. And so if you want to increase agricultural productivity, give farmers incentives to take more risky, higher yield crops, then you're going to provide them with some kind of insurance market so they're willing to do that. Another simple way in which people have dealt with this issue of risk traditionally for many years is the idea of risk sharing among your network of family members and friends. So people insure each other in some sense by pooling their income. So you share income risk by making a big pool. Think about it, it's not really how it happens, but you can think of everybody puts their money in one bag, and then whatever money is in that bag gets distributed equally for everybody. And so just to give a numerical example, if you have, let's say you have n households living in a village, and each household has a crop with probability 1/2, when I toss a coin independently for each household, with probability 1/2, the coin lands heads and you have a high output of 8 units. With probability 1/2, you have a bad crop and the output is 2 units. And so the idea is that on their own, a person is going to have a lot of variability. You can get 8 1 year, 2 for 2 years, then 8 2 years. That's a lot of variability in your income. And so if everybody pulls their income together, you can, mathematically, you can invoke a result called the law of large numbers, which tells you at the individual level there is a lot of risk, meaning you don't know who's going to get a high crop and a low crop. But if you put a lot of people together, you know that exactly half of those people are going to get a high crop and half of those people are going to get a low crop. So as long as n is large, you can be very certain about that. If you only have 2 people, maybe you get unlucky and both have a bad draw. But if you have 1,000 people, then you know that roughly 500 people will get the good draw, 500 people will get the bad draw. And so the pooled income, essentially here, if we replace 8 and 2, would be half of the people get, n over 2 of the people get an income of 8, and n over 2 of the people get an income of 2. And so when you add that up, you get an aggregate income of 5n. And when you divide this equally among everybody, divide by n, it gives everybody a certain income of 5, which is, by the way, if you look at your expected income, that's exactly what your expected income is. With probability 1/2, you get 8. With probability 1/2, you get 2. So your expected income, on average, your income is 5. And so by pooling income, you can guarantee, as long as you have enough people in your pool, that everybody's going to get their expected income, and you eliminate completely the risk. Now, of course, in practice, you don't literally need to bring everybody and put a bag and put everybody's money in the bag and then distribute it. It's enough that if you have a high income, you give a transfer of $3 to a low-income household. Now, why would you be willing to do that? It may have to do with the fact that there may be your kinship, maybe your community. They may have to do with the fact that you're going to interact repeatedly with them, and so in the future you may find yourself in the opposite position, and then by giving a help today, you may be receiving a help in the future. And there is quite a bit of evidence, starting with a famous paper by Townsend, which looked at this in rural India, that there is this informal mutual insurance actually plays a very important role to replace formal insurance markets. Now, obviously, there's some limits to how successful this can be. For example, as I was saying, if there's a aggregate risk, like there is a flood or a drought that affects everybody, then the risk is not independent. Everybody gets a negative drought at the same time. And so aggregate output would be the total amount of money in the bag at the end of the day would be smaller. And so that risk you cannot insure away. Within the village, you may have to go to another village and try to do arrangements with them. There's also other issues that we're going to look in more detail in the future. Essentially, the first one is it creates kind of a perverse incentive, as any form of insurance does. On the one hand, it creates what we call moral hazard, which is the idea if there is some form of effort that you can put towards your crop that increases the probability of your crop being successful, if all of a sudden your income is going to be 5, no matter whether you get an income of 8 or 2, it gives you an incentive not to work as hard on your crop. And if other people in the village can observe your effort, then that's not necessarily a problem. But if this is a hidden action that nobody else can monitor, then this means people will not have an incentive to work as hard, and so the probability of getting high yield crops goes down. Another very important point is that if your crop is not observable, people simply may say, "Oh, I had a bad crop," to try to get collect their money, and that's why these ideas of work well within the village, where there's a lot of monitoring is relatively cheap. You can see whether there was a good or bad crop in your neighbor's field. You can see if they're out there planting every day or not because you live right next to them. If you try to make this bigger, then you run into these problems. And another problem you have is limited enforcement, which is when a person gets high income, they may simply say, "You know what, tough luck, I'm not going to pay." And you may not have any way of enforcing them to pay because you may not have a court in which you can sign a contract in advance. Now, you may have some kind of enforcement. And like I said, when you're looking at the village level, enforcement may be there because people may face risk of being outcasted of their community or something like that. But at a bigger scale, limited enforcement becomes a problem as well. So one of the ways, so this kind of like from a theoretical point of view, the first kind of institution that is very prevalent is this risk-sharing arrangements. When we look at, in particular places like India, there's a very, very common way, very common institution, very predominant institution, which is sharecropping. Sharecropping essentially is an arrangement between the landowner of the worker, where the landowner tells to a farmer, "You can use my land to produce, and then you get half of the crop, I get the other half. Okay. So that's pretty simple rule. Now, as we were saying earlier, if the farmer is your neighbor, that's okay. But essentially, this leads to inefficiency in production because now the farmer, the person putting all the work, only receives half of the marginal benefit of its work. And so it's a little bit like a tax from the point of view of the farmer, which is going to lead to great incentive to work less. This is an example of this idea of hidden action that now you are going to work less than if you were the owner of the field and you had the full field to yourself, and this leads to a reduction in productivity. Okay. This is very common in Asia and Latin America, as I was saying. 84.5 of all tenant land is share crop in Asia, so this is huge. In India, it's 48%, Indonesia is 60%, in Philippines, it's close to 80% of all tenant land is using this institution. In Latin America, it's only 16%, still significant, but nowhere near as high. And so we can kind of try to capture these ideas with a simple formal model. We have a linear production function, so y is equal to a production function that depends on labor, and labor is simply linear, so there's no y equals L, is our production function. And we're assuming there's some cost for the labor, for the farmer. There's a cost of putting effort in the field, and we can summarize that cost as this function here. The more you work, L is how much you work, the more you work, if you work L hours, you have a cost of 1/2 L squared. And this captures the idea that there's an increase in marginal cost to effort. And then, so putting additional effort becomes increasingly more costly. And then we assume for simplicity, the price of the crop you're gonna sell is equal to 1. And so how much would you choose to work as a farmer if you own the field? Well, essentially you're solving this problem, you're maximizing your revenue from the crop minus the cost of your effort, P equals 1, Y equals L. And so we have this profit function. And so essentially we take the derivative. You can see the marginal benefit for every additional extra unit of labor, you produce 1 extra unit of output, which you sell for $1. So the marginal benefit here for you of working 1 extra hour is $1 you sell your crop for. The marginal cost is the derivative of the cost function, which is equal to L. So the marginal benefit is 1, the marginal cost is L. You want to set those two equal to each other, and so you will work for 1 hour if you are the owner of the field. Okay, it's not very important the number 1 that follows from our normalization and from our simplifying assumptions, but we're just going to compare this with what happens with the effort level under sharecropping, where now you only get to keep half of the revenue from your sales. So now your income is not P times Y, but it's a half P times Y because the other half goes to the landowner. And so now your marginal benefit is 1/2. It's not 1 because for every unit of effort you increase, you produce 1 extra unit of output. And then out of that, you only get to keep half of that. You sell it for $1, you only get to keep 50 cents. The marginal cost of your effort is still L. And so now you're going to choose to work half as much under sharecropping that you would if you were the owner. And you can see it's also going to mean that output is going to be half as much as it would have been if you were the owner of the farm. And this is a huge inefficiency. And so sharecropping reduces the output and reduces the amount of labor. Why do we observe this? When there's a way in which this inefficiency can be resolved, which is simply charging, if the landlord were to charge the farmer fixed rent, then this problem doesn't arise anymore because now the marginal benefit would still be equal to 1. Okay, so let's look at that a little bit more carefully. If now instead of having to give half of your crop, which affects your incentive, you have to pay a fixed amount R no matter what your crop is, then as you may remember from your basic microeconomics classes, this is like a fixed cost for you. And so the fixed cost doesn't affect the margin, so it doesn't affect your decision. And so what that means is that now, if you think about if you have to pay rent R no matter what, Now the marginal benefit of working 1 extra unit is going to be equal to 1. You work 1 extra hour, that produces 1 extra unit of output. That extra unit of output you sell for $1, and you get to keep that full dollar. And so under rent, you would decide to work the efficient amount. Now, of course, your income will be lower because now you have to pay this rent R. So R affects your payoff, but it doesn't affect your decision L on how much to work, and it doesn't affect how much is produced. Obviously, R is going to determine how much of the total output produced gets to be kept by the landowner and how much output gets to be kept by the farmer. And so we potentially could choose a value of R that divides output equally between the farmer and the landowner, like it does in the case of sharecropping. And so you could have the same 50-50 arrangement, but now you would have the efficient amount of effort and a higher output. And so this would seem to suggest that sharecropping is a terrible idea. And why is it that we observe it so much? Well, the problem here has to do with risk. Obviously, in this context, we are not thinking there's any risk in the production of output. If now we introduce some risk here, that given an amount of effort, now your crop may fail or not. Now, in the case where your crop fails, you're stuck with a huge rent payment with very low income, and that may actually increase your risk. And so this fixed rent, it solves the incentive problem, but actually transfers all the risk to the land, the farmer. And so just to give a simple example, let's introduce a little bit of risk. So output now is going to be equal to L plus some shock epsilon, which essentially is a random variable. You could think of tossing a coin, and it can be a positive shock or a negative shock with a probability, or it can be a continuous shock. It doesn't really matter. But now the idea is that if you sign a fixed rent, you bear all the risk. And on the other hand, when you share output with the owner, you're only bearing half of the risk. And for those of you who are a little bit more familiar with probability, remember that the variance of y/2, which is your income, when you have sharecropping, is a quarter of the variance you would have under the rent agreement. Okay, so even though you get half of the income, you're dividing the variance of your income by 4, and so that means that you're reducing your risk and you're getting the same expected payoff. So, so under risk sharing, the tenant gets half the output, but 1/4 of the variance or the risk. And so the reason we may observe sharecropping may have to do with the fact that it provides some kind of insurance for farmers. So sharecropping is essentially, even though you sacrifice a certain degree of efficiency and you're going to produce less output, but you gain in the fact that now you're going to have less risk. And risk, if you're not talking about minor risk, when you're talking about rural agricultural subsistence farming, risk may be the risk of your life or a famine in your family. And so this is very high risk, and that's the reason why perhaps sharecropping is so predominant. So just to summarize, fixed rent contract is best for efficient but worse for insurance. If the tenant is risk averse and landlord is risk neutral, then the landlord can take all the risk by offering a fixed wage to the farmer. Now, problem is that given the fixed wage, the farmer has no incentive to work. And so when you have rent, all the risk goes to the tenant. When you have a fixed wage, now all the risk goes to the landlord, which maybe the landlord has a lot of different plots, so he doesn't care, he's risk neutral, but it provides, again, pretty bad incentive, because if you get a fixed wage, no matter what you produce, you're not going to work very hard. And so sharecropping is somehow of a compromise between efficiency of how much you produce and providing incentive for the tenant to work hard and insurance. Another way in which you could do that is cost sharing. Cost sharing essentially means that not only the benefit, but also the cost can be shared between the landlord and the tenant. And so now what this means is that instead of just giving half of your crop, you're going to give half of your profits to your landlord. And so now when you're choosing how much to maximize, this 1/2 factors out, and you essentially end up with the same optimal choice. When you take the derivative here now, your marginal benefit is half, but also your marginal cost is half. Okay? Your marginal benefit is 1/2 when under cost sharing, but your marginal cost gets also divided by half. And so you end up making the efficient amount of labor effort equal to 1, and the efficient amount of output is produced. But at the same time, if there was some risk in output, now you have some form of insurance, okay? Because you're, for the same argument as before, reducing your volatility. And so cost sharing may be a good alternative. So there's other institutions we will mention briefly. One has to do with money lenders and interlinked contracts. This is a situation where 2 or more contracts exist between 2 people. And so what typically happens is that the landowner is also a money lender. And so with transition from subsistence to commercial agriculture, the role of the money lender changed. And so the farmers need cash because they need to buy seeds, fertilizer, anything. They need that money in advance. And so often the money lenders, and maybe they need to survive if they're planting something like tea or rubber that is not edible. And so they have a need for cash, but the money lender sometimes is more interested in acquiring the land through a default rather than earning the interest on the loan. And so what they do, and perhaps resell the land in a speculation market if they see prices are going to go up. And so rather than earning interest of the loan, you set the loan in a way that it cannot be paid back. And so it gets defaulted, and then the farmer has no choice but to give the land to the money lender. So interest rates on money lenders' loan range from 50 to 200%. Many can't repay and lose their land. They become sharecroppers, and also many immigrate to urban centers. And so this has led to somewhat of a concentration in land. Now, of course, all of this then gets resold, and so big changes. Another important point is to keep in mind when we're thinking about farmers that most of the farmers, more and more, for example, in places like India, where a lot of the male figure in the household have moved to a city for a kind of wage job, that most of the farmers are women. Women provide 60 to 80% of agricultural labor in Africa and Asia, and about 40% in Latin America. Typically, they do so for no payment. They work longer hours than men. And government assistance programs, as we talk about urban bias, there's also a male bias. And there's this idea that farmers are men when really most farmers are women. And also, there's some studies that show that when these programs are targeted at women, for example, if there's some, if the woman in the household is in charge of the income in rural households, there's a larger fraction of income that is spent on children, food, education, and so on. And so it has more beneficial effects in the community. There's also microfinance programs that typically has been targeted to women because they have higher repayment rates. And there's also conditional cash transfers where you pay money to mothers if their children attend school. These type of programs have been a lot more successful than programs that target men. Okay, finally, I leave you with a video to try to put a little bit of things in context about Rwanda and how Rwanda is trying to become the next Singapore of Africa. Singapore essentially, when in the 1960s, the Asian tigers and the Asian economy started to go through the development process, and all the foreign corporations went to Asia to set up their headquarters there and set up manufactories there. You need a place where all the headquarters, a place that is good for business, that has easy laws, that is easy to access, that is relatively safe and stable. And that place in Asia became Singapore. It made Singapore one of the wealthiest countries in the world today. And so the video talks a little bit about the case of Rwanda and how Rwanda has been trying to become. We've been talking about this issue, can sub-Saharan Africa become the next Asia? Can all the Asian, as manufacturing wages go up in Asia, will firms move to sub-Saharan Africa? If so, there's going to be the need for a business hub, and Rwanda is trying to take up the place. So I leave you the link. I hope you liked the video and enjoyed and learned something also about real war. Okay. All right, let me finish here. Thank you for watching.